Our next speaker, he has a diverse global experience in marketing, having run several agencies and helping clients like I heard Adidas, Microsoft, Apple, you name them.
Oh, that sounds good when you say it.
So we're happy to have you. Robert Kabus, stage is yours.
Hello. Getting past 12:30, so I imagine folks are hungry for a presentation about PR value, I think. So this is, and here we are. I come from Dataxet. Briefly, we're a media intelligence provider in Southeast Asia. We started in 2020, and now we're in 4 countries around the region. So we come from the media intelligence perspective, and what we're going to talk about today is that we feel that given where developments have happened with AI, given new frameworks, that there's an opportunity to take maybe kind of a tired topic a little bit about PR value, but actually elevate it from an output tactical type of product to something that's actually strategic and drives insights. So on the upside, hopefully we'll be inspired about that. On the downside, there are a few presentation sins I can give you a heads up about. A little bit of beating an old issue to death, bringing a 40-year-old American movie cultural reference into the presentation, and also slipping in a couple slides about our product. So we all, on our side, live in the world of data, and when you live in data, there's basically a continuum there, right? On the positive side, if you're adding value to that data, that's a good thing. You're a partner. But if you're not, then you're living in the world of becoming a commodity. That world is about lower prices, a lot of churn, and you're fairly expendable. When we look at the high value side, right, that's the utopia, right? No churn, ever increasing customer lifetime value, increasing average revenue per client. So that's the place we want to be. And in the data business, we always have to find ways in everything we do to say what's the maximum amount of value we can extract and deliver for clients. So the idea of value is directly linked to the outcomes. How are you helping clients with their challenges, with their goals, with their priorities? Unfortunately, as we heard in previous discussions, and as we've seen from Gartner research, it doesn't happen that often, right? Analytics don't deliver the outcomes that people expect. A lot of it has to do with what we know, right? It's that idea that if you put 100% of your energy towards perfecting the data, you don't have time to actually go ahead and do it. I'm not going to deal with that so much, a little bit, but it's really the other end of this, which is just what's your intention? A lot of times when we design the analysis we do, we're not designing for outcomes. We're designing for more tactical types of metrics, whether they be vanity or whether they be tactical. So this is about how can we bring PR value into this world. So yeah, I don't think anybody here is in love with AVEs. We know it's still prevalent. That's fine. A lot of things that have been developed over the years and brought are actually quite good. It's a deeper interrogation of each item, of what's been put out in the news coverage for that, and they tend to fall into visibility, messaging, and tonality buckets. Those are things like visibility would be, it's in the headline, the brand's in the first paragraph. It's a high-reach news source out there. Messaging, keywords, key messaging, spokesperson type of things, and then, of course, tonality, sentiment. So these are all really good things, good development, and they've brought us out of vanity, I think, and into tactical value. But it keeps kind of revving off of that, it feels like, from what I've seen in the marketplace. So as warned, the analogy is Spinal Tap, 1980s rockumentary spoof.
This is a chart to what we use on stage, but it's
volume?
Very special because if you can see, the numbers all go to 11. Look, right across the board. 11, 11,
and most of
11,
the
and then
amps go up to 10.
Exactly.
Does that mean it's louder? Is it any louder?
Well, it's one louder, isn't it? It's not 10. You see, most blokes are going to be playing at 10. You're on 10 here, all the way up, all the way up, all the way up. You're on 10 on your guitar. Where can you go from there? Where?
I don't know.
Nowhere, exactly. What we do is if we need that extra push over the cliff, you know what we do?
Put it up to 11.
11, exactly. One louder.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
Wow, better response. I thought only people over 55, which I don't, is that just me? Would do it. So that's the question, right? So how do we get out of that bucket and move it over into strategy? So here's how we're thinking about it. As we were designing our approach, there was really 4 things that we felt were critical to be able to deliver. One was just getting out of the output more into the outcome world, right? What is PR's contribution, the kind of contribution that you would want to talk with people in the C-suite or not. The other was a scope. And actually, I think Johnny Bentwood from Golan talked about this earlier, which is that we tend to look at PR value as just a single brand, right? But without the context of what's happening competitively, and this is one of the things that AI opens up in terms of the ability to do this analysis, is competitive set is everything, right? Because then you get a true measure of really where you sit, how your category works. So you're taking it out of a silo and into a world of pretty rich context for it. And then takeaway, how do we make it more about insight-driven? And there was also some talk, I think in a couple presentations, like about the Binet and Fields research, which talked about long-term brand effects. So can we create something that we can consistently look at as a tool to help us start to drive decisions based on a more sort of a deeper understanding of how our communication is working? So how do we make measurement a tool for outcomes? So the holy grail is, the things we, would talk about is big business outcomes, sales, website impact, event impact, So all these things are great, but, the reality, and I think, I take this a little bit out of like what Professor McNamara was talking about, also the Golan, presentation, which is that idea of real ROI is quite elusive, unless you happen to have, I don't know, maybe it's like the Weather Kids campaign we saw, like something that's just pure PR and you can look at results of it. But 90-something% of what we do has a lot of other channels, a lot of other things affecting what's happening out there. So, if you really want to be able to do it for campaigns like that, massive MMA types of analysis, long-term analysis, still hard to identify attribution in a way. So we're not dealing with that so much when we talk about taking media intelligence data, right? For us, the desired model is a little more simple and efficient. How do we take big data at scale and make it, turn it into insight-driven stuff? How do we correlate to realistic measures, but important ones, and do this in a way that's repeatable and actionable? So that starts with having a construct about the common outcomes to all PR campaigns, right? So we're going to move away from, a specific project goal, specific project output, but what are we looking to achieve in each that we do? So the thought was maybe we can borrow something more useful from the world of advertising and brand than borrowing AVE's, advertising value. So, the thing that marketers, NPR, and brand people, use that's repetitive, repeatable, competitive, and actionable is the idea of brand health, right? So in all the brands that was mentioned, that I've worked on, like Microsoft, Adidas, P&G, and all them, everybody who's got a sense of discipline about it does a brand health survey in order to get to a few metrics, that are really critical that they could then correlate over time to sales and performance. So in advertising and branding, it tends to work about awareness, top of mind, unaided, aided, recall. Affinity, do people know me? Do they like me? How do they feel about me? Or not. And then finally, things in the preference bucket. And there's lots of metrics underneath these, consideration, intent. But the idea is you try and get it down to some things that you can kind of see over time in an actionable way. So what is that for PR? So in all of our conversations in developing this and doing this and looking at it, it seemed to, and I think, we've heard these in different presentations, really 3 things that are in common, right? Are you getting the story on the radar of the stakeholders you're looking to do? Are you doing that with some degree of credibility? Is it a believable, trustworthy, authoritative way of doing it? And then finally, what about influence, right? Like all of these things are meant to move people in some way. The way they think, what they do, what they might feel, but there's some element of influence in there. So this is our construct, and what we do is, once we have that construct, we can bring back those measures that we talked about earlier that are currently being used and have value, but now, we can actually put them in a more goal-oriented structure, right? So, nobody's gonna, talk about, wow, my goal is to get really good potential audience reach, or I want to get 40% of my stories into the headline or first paragraph. But we see through research that these have direct correlations to the ability to drive awareness, a greater likelihood to see and retain what you've seen out there. In credibility bucket, things like spokesperson, to convey greater authority for that. And then influence, sentiment, and brand associations, which is sort of key messaging, keyword stuff. And then, this construct also inspired us to look at, some new definitions of what we can add in terms of metrics. When we say media quality, as we've seen the world move where people go less directly to news sources and go through social media and things like that, what's emerging as something that's having a correlation to credibility is where do people go most frequently? So it's not the biggest, it's not necessarily always the most prestigious, but we see data saying that it's the ones that people go to on a consistent basis, because a lot of things we see are fairly random based on clickbait and other things. Share a story is part of the competitive thing that I talked about. So, when a story actually contains 2, 3, 4 brands, where do you sit in that? Are you the dominant one? Do you have positive sentiment around what you're doing? Is it on message? So we look at share of story exposure in those particular instances. And then influence is like all about bringing in now the consumer perspective. So we've added some social metrics that I'll talk a little bit about later. But these are things that allow us to understand how is a brand performing once we get into a world where we can look at engagement amongst consumers for that. So these are just some outcomes of what we do, and you can kind of see, and the data's we've mixed up a bit, so it's not necessarily the way it was, but the story is the same, which is that when you look at this, immediately you start to understand where you sit, how you look versus competitors, where you're performing well, where you're lagging, and then that starts to open up what any good kind of strategic insight exercise does, which is where do you go from there? So let's say we want to look at awareness and what's going on between BYD and Toyota in the electronic vehicle world, and then we'll do a deep dive on some of those metrics, and then this is where it says like, oh, we understand that Toyota at this stage pre-launch hadn't actually got a lot of visuals out about their brand, so nothing was really showing up at the stories, so they were lacking there. So again, this is just being able to say, not a laundry list, of just metrics, but organizing them and looking at them in a way that lets us start to build an understanding of how we're performing against the key deliverables for PR. And then we can, and if we want, this is a fairly quantitative thing we go through, but this also opens up investigations of how is BYD, doing certain things? How are they, able to get more stories in the headlines? So we might look at the quality of what they do, but the first go-round is meant to be fairly automated. Influence I talked about before. This is an example on influencers. So, as we identify influencers and we look at the performance of the brand with those influencers, we can compare that to what those influencers typically do in their content. We do the same thing on the publishers. When a publisher story gets carried over to their owned media, we look at how does that story compare to what they typically do on their owned media. So, these are just a couple examples of high-level outputs that we do. The other thing that was talked about, the Binet and Fields research, I think in the LinkedIn presentation. So it's just that increasingly, the brand science is really telling us, that we need to think about things long-term. So just assessing a campaign ad hoc one time sort of undervalues what the contribution could be to our understanding. So, looking at things long-term is where you understand that, being able to be consistent, being able to be strategic about how you think about those drivers of your brand. I guess as the Golan guy, Johnny Bentwood, said, they're important proxy measures, right? Awareness, credibility, influence. These are things that you can directly affect. They're super important, and you can sort of start to then understand, their relationship to things like sales and other business effects. So, we can build this over time and consistently do it for what we do. And the other thing about it is that it's not, we have a default scale that works, but if a client says, we're doing a product launch, right, we can overweight the awareness bucket, right? We want to get the story out. We want to start to put that on people's radar. If somebody has a perception issue, we can also look at that and say, well, there's issues about credibility and influence that are going to be more important. We can overweight that if we need to. So there's a dynamic element to it because, again, it's all about trying to say, this is what you're trying to achieve. How can we look at sort of the traditional world of PR value in a different way that lets us understand how we can help drive a few more business decisions in a more insightful way. So this is just kind of a summary slide for it to say that, there is this continuum. We think it's ready for this sort of next strategic level, more outcome-driven, as a way that we can kind of move our ability to, I guess, be more of a partner to clients than a vendor. That's it.
Thank you, Robert.
Sure.
So, do we have any questions in the audience? Questions for Robert? No one? So, we have some time, so maybe I will ask you a question. So, your methodology definitely goes beyond traditional metrics. Is it sometimes difficult to convince your clients to use the new methodology instead of old school measurement?
Yeah, so for context, we launched this at the beginning of this year, right? So 2 points of context. We launched at the beginning of the year, and we're also heading towards a fully automated product to do this. So we're not quite fully automated, but what we found is that for the idea, there are certain types of clients. There are clients who are going to love AVEs. We're always going to deal with that. And even some of the tactical measures. Bonus is tied to that. That's their legacy, and that's fine. But there's a customer segment out there that we're finding which is just more interested in pushing forward on, like, how can they be better informed on some of their decisions and campaigns. So, for that segment, there's a lot of receptivity that we now have a lot of our first run trials going through and proof of concept type stuff, you might call it. So I think the idea of these metrics, are good. And again, we see it as sort of step one, like when we looked at the social influence. We think that bucket is going to become increasingly important given the nature of where the media and how people are sourcing stories and news and that kind of thing. So we think that'll become bigger, but step one, I think, it feels like it hasn't been a super challenge, to the concepts, because it takes a lot of familiar stuff, and rebuckets it as a starting point. So I think people are fairly comfortable with, oh yeah, those metrics,
All right, brilliant. So, thanks again, Robert.
Okay.
Please give another round of applause.
Thank you.
So,